Okay, welcome to the lecture for Research Methods. We're talking about the second half of Chapter 4 of the APA Manual, Mechanics of Style. Just covering a few more basics of kind of grammatical things. The first thing we'll talk about would be capitalization. A lot of it's pretty obvious. Capitalize the first word at the beginning of a sentence. Nothing new there. It's a little different. Also, be sure you capitalize the first word after a colon if that word begins a complete sentence. In terms of titles, books and articles, the rules are a little different for in the text versus in the reference section of the paper. In the reference section, you only capitalize the first word, right, of a title, but in text you capitalize all the major words, so all the nouns, in verbs, adverbs, adjectives, things like that. One thing that's maybe a little unique to our area, you don't capitalize the word soldier if it doesn't appear at the beginning of the sentence. I know that's kind of Army style. We're talking about the soldiers to capitalize that word, and I can understand that, but it's not APA style to do that. And then there's a couple of things in the method section which I won't go into detail here, but just kind of remind you that when you're writing the method section, look back at this part of the manual about capitalization, because there's a couple of unique things that will come up really only in the method section. If you're talking about specific things involving numbers, like on day 2 of experiment 4. For some reason, day and experiment are capitalized in that phrase. And there's a couple of things like that, but if you read the manual, it's straightforward. But I think I would just confuse if I tried to explain their kind of odd rules. So at the method section, look back and make sure that you're capitalizing appropriately, because there's some weird rules there. In terms of italics, the titles of books, movies, articles get italicized. If you're introducing a new technical term, and we talked about this before, we talked about use of quotation marks. When you introduce a new technical term, you italicize it the first time only. After that, you don't italicize anymore. And if it's not a technical term, but you're introducing a term, then you use quotes instead of italics. So a little weird difference there. And then the most common use of italics that you'll probably see usually happens in the method section. Anchors of a scale. Persons rated their likelihood of doing something from 1 to 10, and then what 1 stands for and what 10 stands for goes in italics. An example would be participants rated the degree to which they agreed with the proposed agenda items using a scale that ranged from 1, parentheses, not all agree, to 5, completely agree. So the things inside the parentheses, the anchors, get italicized. And notice here, we'll talk about numbers in a minute. This is kind of one instance where when a number occurs as a numeral, not as a word, whenever it's talking about anchors of a scale, it's a numeral, not a word. Abbreviations, when deciding whether to abbreviate a word, things to think about, is something that's typically abbreviated, a conventional abbreviation. So like the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, second version. The MMPI, that's a pretty common abbreviation. So if you're going to talk about the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, perfectly appropriate to abbreviate that, because other people do as well. But things like short-term memory, you don't see that abbreviated very often unless you're using that phrase over and over again. So if it's gonna be real repetitive, using kind of a longish phrase, you abbreviate. But if it's not convincingly done, be wary. And the other thing to think about is, are you going to save a lot of space by abbreviating something? If you're going to have to use a phrase more than once, because obviously the first time you use it, you're going to have to write it out. So it's only things that you're going to be using multiple times. Are you really going to be saving a lot of space in the text by abbreviating, and will it make sense to kind of know what you're talking about? When you do abbreviate, like I said, make sure the first time you mention the phrase that's going to be abbreviated, you write it out fully, and then the abbreviation follows that fully written out phrase in parentheses. We talked before about sometimes you'll have an abbreviation, you have a phrase, parentheses, abbreviation, and then you'll need something else, like a citation of where that came from. There'll be a semicolon and then the citation. Some common Latin abbreviations that we use a good bit would be EG and IE. Right? IE is probably the one people have the hardest time with. Id est, or that is. It's used whenever you put a word or a phrase in parentheses, typically, that clarifies the previous phrase or sentence. Example would be, when discussing the typical response of teenagers, i.e. rebellion. So in this instance, I'm clarifying that the typical response is rebellion, right? So the thing in parentheses is clarifying an earlier thing, as opposed to e.g., example agatio, or example given, used when you give an example of something identified in the previous phrase or sentence. So if it had been, when discussing the typical responses of teenagers, e.g. rebellion, it's a very similar sentence. So both of them began with, when discussing the typical response, or one first one was response, second one is responses of teenagers, e.g. rebellion. That suggests that rebellion is one example of the typical response, right? It's not clarifying that that is the example. I.e. is more when you're saying, okay, you're talking about this thing, not just an example of many possible things. And then other abbreviations you'll use, the scientific abbreviations, which appear in table 4.4. Don't need to reiterate them here. Just look them up to make sure you're using the right ones. Numbers. The main thing with numbers is whether or not you're going to express them in numerals or in words. Expressing them in numerals, numbers that are 10 and above, any number that's in the abstract, which we'll bit about that rule a good bit. Any number that precedes a unit of measurement, 1 meter, 20 seconds. So, like the 10 and above in numerals, below 10 not numerals, unless there's something else. So, like if you're talking about 4 people, that would be a word, not the numeral. But if it were 4 seconds, well, now it precedes the unit of measurement, and so it becomes a numeral. So it kind of trumps. A number that represents a mathematical function, 4 times as many participants responded. That would be the numeral 4. And then numbers that represent time, dates, ages, scores and points on a scale, we talked about earlier, exact sums of money, and when you talk about actual numbers, like the number 1 appeared at the top of the page, so these the numeral 1. But one kind of weird exception to the time deal, because say participants were asked to read a passage for 3 minutes, that would be a numeral. But if it's an approximate amount of time, then it goes back to being a word. So if it's they responded whether or not they had experienced a dissociative flashback sometime, or a participant responded that he experienced a dissociative flashback about 12 months ago. Well, about 12 months ago isn't an exact time, so that now is in word form, not numeral form. So kind of a weird rule there. An example of some of these things all together in one sentence. When 12 of the 4-year-old participants indicated that they needed 3 times as much time to finish the survey, they blah blah blah. So 12 is a numeral because it's greater than 10. 4 is a numeral because it's having to do with age, and then 3 is a numeral because it's a mathematical function. Okay? So when it's not those things, the numbers are often expressed in words. And also, if a number begins a sentence, which you try not to begin sentences with numbers, if at all possible, but sometimes you have to, because otherwise you end up using the passive voice. So you're going to err on one way or the other. But if you do have to begin a sentence with a number, use the word, even if it's a number that would normally be written as a numeral, like 12. Common fractions, 1/2, 1/3, but not 22/16. That wouldn't be a common fraction, but common fractions are written out as words. So examples, some of these things, 12 participants. So now 12 is the beginning of the sentence, so it's a word. Indicated they needed 1/3 as much time to finish the survey. So 1/3 or 1/3 is a common fraction, so it's written out as a word. And then other times you'll have kind of mixed expression where numbers and words. And sometimes that's just because you're following different rules. And sometimes when you have back-to-back numeric modifiers, things change. So, like 12, in this sense, when 12-year-old participants, normally both of those 12s would be numeral correct. It's not the meaning of sentence, and it's greater than 10. But having two numbers back-to-back, if it could be confusing, then you change one of them to a word. So I'd say don't try to memorize the rules on numbers. Just kind of think about them, see if they make sense to you, and then go back and look at them whenever you're writing a number down and say, okay, well, should this be a numeral or a word? Lastly, APA's policy on metrication, use the metric system, right? So we talk about meters and millimeters and centimeters, not inches and feet. Pretty straightforward stuff. And then some more statistical abbreviations, most of which you're familiar with, but just in case you're not, you can find those in table 4.5 of the manual. So that's about it for the second half of chapter 4 of the APA manual.